Although I was almost 30 years old, I sat like a child in the backseat of my parents' car as my father drove from their home in southern Michigan to Cleveland. From my seat, I could steal a glimpse of my mother's eyes in the mirror, occasionally looking back at me. We had the same eyes, and I'd been told repeatedly my whole life how much I resembled her. It wasn't like me to feel carsick, but I'd been nauseated that whole morning. The discomfort, combined with the heavy silence of the trip, finally got to me, and I leaned in close to my mother's ear and whispered too loudly, "Mom, Mom, guess what exit we're about to pass? Fang Boner Road." And with that little gem of geographic knowledge, we both burst into hysterical laughter. My mother had raised me to be funny without worrying about whether it was proper, to be intelligent and outspoken instead of pleasing and compliant, to make fun of Ohio, but also to recognize my father, who had to live with us, had his limits. "Okay, that's enough," he grumbled from the driver's seat when our laughter reached the volume I knew he could no longer tolerate. There were new rules about what you could and could not say around my mother since her diagnosis. Obviously, no penis jokes was a new regulation my father had been forced to enact on the Ohio Turnpike. You could say all of the big healing words like hope, miracle, and fight, but you could not say dying or death. For 30 years, I had happily assumed my mother was a privilege I was guaranteed, but cancer had fractured our timeline and threatened to end my prolonged childhood. I had suddenly been promoted to caretaker. We both longed for the old terms in a way we were not allowed to speak. After her initial surgery, the doctors claimed to have fully removed the brain tumor, and we all started making hopeful plans for the next year. A year was beyond the normal life expectancy, but my mother was nothing if not exceptional, and we had no interest in the alternative. I put my life on hold, leaving a career and husband in Maryland to be with her, determined to finish as much of the lifetime we'd been promised in the time we had left. She was labeled cancer-free for the 2 months between MRIs. And during that time, I dreamed of having a baby and introducing her to her grandchild, since she had none. The romance of it had almost outweighed the fact that I was nowhere near ready for children. I had only entertained the idea briefly before we got the news that her tumor was back, and efforts shifted again to simply keeping her alive, which had brought us to Cleveland. Waiting there for her surgeon, it struck me as odd, given the circumstances, that I had been compelled to seek out a turkey sandwich. It not only seemed inappropriate to be thinking about food, but I also couldn't ever remember liking turkey sandwiches. Yet I had been overpowered by a craving for one, and it was arguably the best thing I had ever eaten. I had just finished when the doctor emerged and told us my mother was in recovery. But this second removal had been invasive, and she would not be able to walk or speak when she woke. I listened and nodded as my mind drifted, and I thought about how much had changed so quickly in just a month. Then, a sudden sinking feeling took hold of me. Had it been a month? The room spun as pieces of the puzzle came together, and I intuitively knew what had been easier to ignore. A month had passed, and there was the uncharacteristic car sickness and that damn turkey sandwich. When she woke, I assured my mother I had to fly home to Maryland, but I would be back. Days later, I sat, this time listening to my own doctor as he excitedly rattled on about the odds against which I had conceived. One try, and during a time of the month they said you couldn't get pregnant, so not really trying at all. He had assumed the dates on my chart were a mistake, but when ultrasound measurements had proven them right, he treated me like an award-winning science project. I mean, I'm sure it's happened before, but it's miraculous, really. Casually gushing the wrong word, and I had stopped him. It was for my mother, but she's not going to live to see this baby. I added glioblastoma to make sure I didn't have to answer additional questions. The room went silent as he realized that maybe it was miraculous, but this was not the miracle I had ordered. I emailed my father, ashamed of the naive mistake I'd made. No one had wanted to tell my mother, realizing this news was the first real acknowledgement that life would, unthinkably, go on without her. However, when she was informed, she had insisted that my father wheel her to the hospital gift shop, where she purchased outfits for both a boy and a girl. I'd returned back to their home in Michigan when she did, and we spent most days lying side by side, her hand resting on my belly, coming to terms with the parts of life that were not meant for us. I was 20 weeks along when she was rushed to the hospital for the last time. When I arrived, her room at St. Joe's was full of nuns, and she was full of steroids, which allowed her to speak more clearly than she had since Cleveland. One particularly cheery nun flitted around her, and my mom said to me, "I get to be an angel." And the nun had nodded. I considered this scene and asked, how much trouble would we get in if we borrowed an ultrasound cart? Within an hour, I was in bed next to my mom, surrounded now by a dozen nuns as word of the show had spread. And an image of her grandchild sprung to life on the stolen screen. The technician beamed. "Would you like to know the gender?" My mother's eyes lit up, and all the nuns cheered. So I'd consented. Everyone else stared at the screen, waiting eagerly for the news, but I kept my eyes fixed on my mother, drinking her in. 4 years later, driving to the market, we passed a cemetery, and indulging the pain it sent through me, I let my eyes linger on it just a split second too long. I realized my mistake quickly, but it was too late. Looking back, I saw a pair of eyes like mine in the rearview mirror. The silence got to her, and she leaned in as close to my ear as her car seat would allow, whispering loudly as not to wake her little sister, "Mom, Mom, sometimes I miss Grandma Rosie." "Me too, buddy."